so it's been a couple of weeks since we last met, so we'll just do a real quick overview of what we've studied so far. And we've had, Danny did a little intro on the a summary of the book of Daniel so that we can have a broad view of that. And then Josh taught about chapter 1. And so we'll kind of go over that as well, just to refresh our memories. In chapter 1, we saw this introduction to why it takes place in Babylon. So basically we start off, and this is a couple years after Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, had invaded Judah and taken a bunch of people captive, and then he goes on to kind of fight in that area. He invades Egypt also a little bit, as you do, and so that kind of sets the stage for where we're at. That this, the book of Daniel takes place in Babylon. The Israelites are in captivity, and specifically we're going to look at these groups of 4 guys: Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and whatever the other guy, Mishael. I was like, did I already say that one? And so it's 4 Israelites who were probably royalty, who were taken from their homeland, taken to Babylon, and were in training to become wise men. So that was kind of something that Babylon did, that they took young guys in royalty and they kind of had them in the royal palace and the royal grounds, and they would teach them, all kinds of things relating to wisdom from above. And so, what we'll get into today is we'll kind of see what that kind of job looked like, and I think we'll see that it was kind of a sham thing, where they were mostly astrologers and they claimed to have this connection with the supernatural, but we could see that wasn't the case. And so we can only really surmise what kind of education Daniel and his friends went through, but suffice it to say, some of it was probably useful, but a lot of it was probably very superstitious and pagan beliefs and things like that, beliefs in the gods of the Babylonians. So that's kind of what we saw in chapter 1, and then we saw that as they were eating at the king's table, Daniel said and his friends said that they wouldn't eat the king's food because it was because they were called to be separate. And they were convicted of that they didn't want to eat these things that they had been told to eat. And so they presented the steward with a challenge. They said, hey, we're going to eat just vegetables and we'll drink water, and you guys eat what you eat, and after a couple days we'll see who's healthier, and we'll see what happens with that. And so what ends up happening is God blesses Daniel and his friends for their convictions, for separating themselves from this foreign food, and he makes them healthier, and that they look better and more filled out and things like that. And so they are granted the ability to, okay, well, you can do that then. You can eat what you want to eat instead of having to eat the king's food. And so we saw that God blessed their health, and he by doing that he displayed his approval of that separation from the captors. And that's something that we'll see and we'll continue to see, is that specifically Daniel and his friends constantly separate themselves from the culture they find themselves in. So they've been immersed in this foreign culture, and yet they stay apart from it in various different ways. And we'll see some of that tonight and continuing on into the rest of the book of Daniel, at least up until chapter 8. So that was chapter 1. But when we look back into the overall picture of what Daniel is about, Daniel taught us that one of the key theme of the book, not Daniel, is the sovereignty of God, especially in comparison to earthly kingdoms. And with a supremely sovereign king, will be shown a supremely better kingdom. So that's kind of, we see the kind of this, the fallacy of the Babylonian kingdom, and then, the revelation of these dreams, and a couple different things through the narrative of comparing God's kingdom with these earthly kingdoms. And then finally in the prophecy at the end of Daniel, we'll see the establishment of God's kingdom and how that'll look. And through that all, we can really see the sovereignty of God, which is God's working His will with ultimate power and ultimate authority. God has granted, He has the authority over His creation to do whatever He wants with it. And that's kind of what the sovereignty of God looks like. And then we'll kind of see how, as humans, we live in that sovereignty, and how Daniel lives and acknowledges that sovereignty. Because, as we'll see, it doesn't always work out how we think it should work out. If we were sovereign, we would do it differently, or this is how we would do it. But in acknowledging that God is sovereign over all things, we have to acknowledge that everything that happens is under God's control and for God's purposes. And Daniel, of course, will realize that. And so we have here the instrument that God is going to use to display His sovereignty, and that's Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And at the end of, or towards the end of chapter 1, after the first test with the food, and after Daniel and friends, I'll just call them Daniel and friends, after they complete their training, they're placed in a position of trust in Nebuchadnezzar's court. And they're placed there specifically to accomplish God's will and to reveal God's sovereignty through these various really testings of Daniel and opportunities for Daniel to display God's power and glory. So, in our passage today, we'll see I put it in quotes, a challenge to God's sovereignty and wisdom, brought about by God Himself. So, King Nebuchadnezzar is given a dream, and usually when we say, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, that must have been in his head, and it was really up to Daniel to figure out what that meant. No, we know that this dream was a dream given to him by God. God chose Nebuchadnezzar to be the vessel for this dream, not for the interpretation, but for the dream specifically. And so we can see even in a situation where the people of God are put in mortal peril, God is still sovereign over that situation. So we're going to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 23. Could I get some volunteers to read that for me? We'll probably do. Who wants to do 1 through? 1 through 9.
I can do that.
Okay, Josh will do 1 through 9. Who wants to do 10 through 16. Danny? Okay, and then who wants to finish off with 17 through 23? Melissa? Okay. So Josh, if you could start us off, we'll read this, and it's it is kind of a narrative passage, so that we're going to be moving along, and but there's a lot to learn from this text here. So.
Okay. Now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians and conjurers, the sorcerers and the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to him, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, saying, O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare its interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldean, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, that I may know you can declare its interpretation.
The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests. There is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men. They sought Daniel and his companions to kill him. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation.
Oh, sorry. Then Daniel went to his house and told his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, urging them to ask the God of heaven for mercy concerning this mystery, so Daniel and his friends would not be killed with the rest of Babylon's wise men. The mystery was then revealed to Daniel in a vision at night, and Daniel praised the God of heaven and declared, May the name of God be praised forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. He changes the times and seasons. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals the deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I offer thanks and praise to you, God of my fathers, because you have given me wisdom and power. And now you have let me know what we asked of you, for you have let us know the king's mystery.
Great. Thank you. So, let's just start back in verse 1. And before we get into the king's dream, I want to just address a little bit the a quote-unquote discrepancy that you might see in verse 1. It says in verse 1, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. But we know that that from chapter 1, and I'll try to lay out a timeline that we know. Israel is invaded and conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. We know that. Then 3 years have to pass for Daniel and his companions to become wise men. And so how do we have in chapter 2, verse 1, in Nebuchadnezzar's second year of being king, how are Daniel and his friends being held accountable for being wise men if it's only Nebuchadnezzar's second year of being king? And the answer, it kind of has to do with the difference between how the Babylonians counted the years of their rulers versus how everyone else normally would count the years of their rulers. The Babylonians didn't consider the first year of a king's kingdom or reign as part of that counting. So the year that he ascends to the throne is not counted in there. So when it says in the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar, what we're actually seeing is that would be his third year of ruling Babylon, which would give him time to ascend to the throne, invade Israel and Egypt, bring captives back, begin and essentially finish the training for Daniel and his companions, and then this dream episode can take place.
It's almost like year 0.
Yeah.
Year second.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Exactly. And then also we have that combined with how sometimes Israelites would count years where if it was a part of a year, then that counts as one whole year. So so their training might have actually been maybe 2.5 years, but they would count it as 3 years. For example, Daniel 1:1 says that Nebuchadnezzar raids Israel in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim in Judah. But in Jeremiah 46:2, it says that Israel and Egypt were raided by Nebuchadnezzar in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. And so we know that by the Babylonian counting, they're like, oh, that's Jehoiakim's 3rd year that we raided him. But it was actually the 4th year. But they're like, oh, his 1st year doesn't count. And they're like, what do you mean? It's like, well, we conquered you, so you're going to count this way now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we can see that that there is a. It's not that they're wrong. It's just that that's how they count it differently. So if anyone ever says, oh well, Daniel says that they were raided here, and Jeremiah says here, that's how it's brought together and it's reconciled. So Daniel says that Nebuchadnezzar had dreams in his 2nd year, but we know it was really the 3rd year of his reign. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But getting into the actual story, Nebuchadnezzar has a problem. So we'll see Nebuchadnezzar's problem, and then we'll see Daniel's resolution of that problem in the latter part. Well, it's really the middle of the chapter. He's had a dream, and from when we can see the resolution of the issue, as far as we can tell, it was a single dream that he had, and he had several times, because it said Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, but Daniel only reveals to him one dream, and so we say, okay, it was something that he had been repeated over and over, and that had been bothering him greatly. Something that he remembered. And the nature of this dream was such that it was keeping him from sleeping. It was making him anxious. So he called his people, the wise men, to help him. And Daniel's specific when he's listing out the advisors who were called. And Daniel doesn't consider himself as part of these, because we know that Daniel was not consulted in this initial run-up, because when Arioch comes to him, Daniel's like, hey, what's going on? What is all this about? And so we know that Daniel wasn't part of this initial group. Magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and Chaldeans. And so the first three are kind of like, okay, magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, we've kind of run into these types of people before. But what does it mean by Chaldeans? Who are, like, that sounds like a people group. And it is. So the Chaldeans were a very early people group that were in that region of Babylon, which is now modern day Iraq, which is between the Euphrates and Tigris River. Remember, Abram came from Ur of the Chaldeans. So this was an old people group that's always been there. Obviously now this is, 1,000 years later. And so what had happened is the Chaldeans were now a much smaller group, and they were very much pigeonholed into astrologer types. So, they weren't so much a like genetic group of people, so much as like, oh, these were the people who watched the skies and the people who spoke with the gods and things like that, and were able to advise the king on matters pertaining to dreams and things like that in their interpretation. And so that's what is referred to when we read about the Chaldeans here in this context. And again, we can infer that, from reading verse 15, that Daniel and his friends were not in this group that were called to advise. But, why weren't they in this group? Why weren't Daniel and his friends brought in to advise on this matter? Because if you remember from a couple weeks ago, back in chapter 1, let me just read here chapter 1 and verse 19. Speaking about Daniel and his friends, it says, "And the king spoke with them," Daniel and his friends, and among all of them, meaning all of the wise men, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. Wow, so that's very impressive. Obviously the king is very impressed with them. He likes them. He finds them, way better. Their effectiveness is through the roof. They actually do their job. He likes them. And then we get to chapter 2, and they're nowhere to be found. Why doesn't the king call his most trusted advisors that are 10 times better than everyone else? Well, it's because when we read in chapter 1, that passage there, what we're actually reading is kind of like a summary of Daniel's career. So I left out the last verse in chapter 1 for a reason. And it says, "And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus." So that really tips us off that passage right there where it says Daniel spoke with the king and he found them 10 times better, all the way till the end of chapter 1, is really a summary of the next 6 chapters of all of Daniel's career. And when we go to chapter 2, we actually find ourselves back to the beginning of Daniel's career, before Nebuchadnezzar really has seen God's power displayed through Daniel and his friends. And so this is kind of like, not really a flashback. The other thing was like, this is what's happening, and now we're going to show you what has happened in that career. So that's why we can see that Daniel was not included in this initial group of people, because if he was, he probably would have been going to God right away. But that wasn't the case, because he was ignorant about the matter. And then we'll see through the next couple chapters how God puts Daniel and his friends in that place of trust in the Nebuchadnezzar's court. But they're not there yet. but we'll look into that. So with most of the wise men around him, and especially the Chaldeans, who are the ones that kind of represent the others, they're the ones who speak for the rest of this cohort. Nebuchadnezzar poses the problem to them. He's had a dream, and it's bothering him greatly because he doesn't understand what the dream means. Now, some of the translations say, make the dream known to me when he's asking for it. And so some people are like, oh, he doesn't remember the dream. He doesn't know what it was. So he's like, I've had a dream, and now you got to tell me what it was because I don't remember. But I think it's obvious when it's translated understanding. That he doesn't understand the dream. He knows what it is, but he doesn't understand it, and that'll become that's a key part of Nebuchadnezzar's test. Because how can you test the efficacy of someone's interpretation if you don't know what the answer to the question is? And so the Chaldeans respond and they say, "Oh, we'll interpret the dream once you tell it to us. Like that's our job. You tell us what your dream was, and we'll tell you what it means." And so, real quick, just a short detour, and that is in verse 4. It says, "Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, 'O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream will show the interpretation.'" So one thing to note is that Daniel switches the language that he is writing in. Up to this point, the book has been written in Hebrew. But in verse 4, you can see that he says that the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, and then Daniel starts writing in Aramaic when they start speaking. And the narrative continues in Aramaic until up through chapter 7. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, switches back to Hebrew. That's when Daniel's prophecy begins. So Aramaic is actually very similar to Hebrew. When I was looking at it on a Blue Letter Bible, it would be indistinguishable to me, the lettering. Like it looks almost exactly the same to me. That's with extensive training in Hebrew. Yeah. So it's written very similarly, but it was a separate language, and it was one that was kind of preferred by the kingdoms to the east of Israel. I consider it like a trade language, something like Greek was back in the Roman Empire, where everyone kind of knew a little Greek, and so they used that because they could communicate with each other. Now, the primary language of the Babylonian Empire was Akkadian, but Aramaic, again, would have been a common language that they could have spoken with, kingdoms to the east, Persia, and kingdoms to the west, like Palestine, and Aramaic continues up to the time of Christ even. So we know that it was a common language in that area. And so why does Daniel switch to Aramaic? What would be the reason for that? One theory is that Daniel wasn't, that it would have been because now it was focused on Babylonian matters, that chapters 2 through 7 talk about. It's pretty much all about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar this is a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and here's the interpretation, or this is a decree that Nebuchadnezzar made, and we didn't follow it, and we were thrown into the fire and the lion pit and all kinds of things. And they were thrown everywhere. And so instead of things that focus directly on Israel, it's something that had more to do with the kingdom of Babylon. And then we also know that when Daniel switches back to Hebrew is when the prophetic portion of the book begins, and Daniel is relating a prophecy related to to Israel specifically. We can also see that Daniel might have been tailoring the narrative to a more general audience, even though he was writing to his fellow countrymen in bondage. There might have been people that he wanted to include in that audience who would have spoken in Aramaic, and then the prophecy at the end would have been directed, of course, to the Israelites. So just a quick side note that the original, it's probably the largest chunk of Aramaic in the scripture, and so that's kind of why when you say what language was the Bible written in, it was Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And this is kind of that section where it's in Aramaic. Okay, so the Chaldeans want Nebuchadnezzar to tell the dream, and they will interpret it, which is a pretty standard thing. Archaeologists have found in that region, like Baghdad and around Iraq, dream interpretation tablets from that time period as well, where it was common practice to take common dream elements and assign them meanings, and frankly, we do that today also. That's not uncommon for people to want to find meaning in their dreams and in everyday life, but dreams specifically. And the easiest way to do that is just to say, oh, this, if you see like a car in a dream, that means that you want to go traveling or something. I don't know. Some common meaning where it doesn't take a whole lot of effort. It's, uniform across the board, so they don't have to make something up each time. They have interpretation tablets. And oftentimes, that's good enough for people. They're like, sure, yeah, why not? And if it's good enough for people today, then it's good enough for people back then. Astrology is a very common thing where it's like, oh, if you're born under this sign, then you have these characteristics in your life, or if you're these people of these signs don't get along and these people do. And it's always funny to say your birthday and they'll be like, oh yeah, I could tell. And I'm like, ha, that wasn't my birthday, I'm actually this. And they're like, well yeah, you would. It's like, that wasn't my birthday either. And you just keep going back and forth, and they'll think they'll know every time, but they'll always be wrong. But so Nebuchadnezzar, he recognizes this. He knows that his wise men and the people that he's set up around him, that they do have these tricks. They have these tablets. They have their conventions, and they're just waiting to hear the dream and the keywords so that they can spit out the answer. They're just waiting for the input so that they can give the output. It wouldn't be any different than a calculator. You put in some numbers, add them together, and you have an answer. That's kind of what that Chaldeans and the magician and the enchanters were waiting for. They were willing to give that. They were like, yeah, just tell us what the dream is, and we'll tell you what it means. Why is that so hard? We've done this before. But Nebuchadnezzar doesn't want to go this route. And God, being sovereign, we can say that he put this into Nebuchadnezzar's heart, that instead of just telling them the dream and getting the proper answer, God wanting to use this vessel, Nebuchadnezzar, as a vessel for his prophecy and for this comparison of kingdoms, put it on his mind to reject those false interpretations. So Nebuchadnezzar says that there's going to be a test. Not only do you have to tell me what the dream means, but they also have to tell him what the dream was in the first place. And so this put them in kind of a tight spot, because without knowing the dream, they couldn't give an interpretation. because they don't have that supernatural connection that they always claim they do. The king recognizes that this dream specifically, is from a supernatural source. Not necessarily God, but he realizes that this is something that is important and would require supernatural means to interpret it. If his wise men couldn't tell him what the dream was in the first place, then maybe they're not as in tune with the supernatural as they claim. Now, even without wise men, he probably... So, looking forward a little bit, we'll just say the dream was of a particularly troubling nature to Nebuchadnezzar. So, we'll read, or we'll learn about next week, that the dream was of a statue, right, made of different materials, all the way from, I think it was gold to like iron and clay, and then it crumbles, etc., and is destroyed. So, and we know that Nebuchadnezzar knows what this dream is. He knows the content of the dream. And so even without the interpretation, even without understanding it, Nebuchadnezzar knows that it is, whatever the interpretation is, would be of particular interest to him. Because he sees a man, a giant statue, and he sees it all made of different materials, and then he sees its destruction. And so in his mind, he's thinking that, this has great importance, particularly to, possibly men of, might, men of power. Maybe it relates to kingdoms. Maybe it relates to my kingdom. Maybe it relates to me. All these things are probably going through his head because, he's got this picture in his mind, and it's freaking him out, and it's keeping him up. And so, with that in mind, we know that, Nebuchadnezzar is not interested in just the regular interpretation. He really wants to know what this means because he's thinking that it has a lot to do with himself. And so he has a particular interest in having the true, actual interpretation and not, the regular nonsense of the wise men. In fact, he's so adamant about getting that true interpretation that he says that the penalty is death. That if they can't tell him what it is, he's going to kill them all. Rip them limb from limb and destroy their households. Probably killing their families. Taking all their stuff. And that's, it's clear that this dream has put him in a state of desperation. Of course, when we zoom out, we can see that this is another display of God's sovereignty. We can see how God has worked, even so far, in displaying a few things. And one thing that I thought would be interesting, and just real quick, and if you could think of anything, how many times before has God shown the worthlessness of wise men and prophets of other gods and religions? What are some things that you can think of previously, and I mean, I guess after, examples in Scripture where God shows that the ways of the world are really, worthless.
Well, my mind it's not a foreign king or a Gentile king, but my mind immediately goes to Solomon. His life plus in Ecclesiastes, he had it all. He had all the sovereignty, biggest, wisest, and all that stuff. But in the end, surveying it all, he realized it's just vanity, a bunch of wind.
Yeah. So that's an example where, Solomon grew up with the God of his fathers, and he was like, yeah, I'm gonna try to find out for myself. And then God allowed him to do that, and he came to the conclusion that, there's nothing out there except for for God. What are some other examples of where God really reveals how useless other systems are?
I think of the plagues in Egypt and Pharaoh.
Yeah, so for the first couple plagues, they were able to kind of replicate some of the plagues a little bit, but eventually they were just like, we can't do this. Like this is crazy. This is clearly from God. Yeah, so that's a time where Pharaoh thought he had magicians. He thought he had people with connection to the supernatural, but they were, God showed them to be fakes.
Pharaoh not number one, but Pharaoh in the time of Joseph also has a dream that nobody can kind of get at, and guy remembers Joseph in prison and says, "Hey, I met this guy once who interpreted a dream."
Yeah.
And he wanted me to get him out of prison. That was the whole thing. Also, I think of Elijah, and again, not a non-Israelite king. But Ahab and the prophets of Baal and everything.
Yeah, where they built the altar.
Their little altar all day long and everything.
Yeah, so, and God used that situation where, they did everything they could to call down to their God to do something. And Elijah was like, well, just pour it with water, do everything you can to make this as hard as possible. And then God immediately just destroys the whole thing from Elijah's request. So, these are all great examples of how God really reveals how weak and pitiful the so-called great wise men are, apart from him. So, of course, these wise men are no different. They have no idea what the dream could be, so they stall for time. And really the stalling for time, the king says it exactly. He says, you're just stalling for time because you think that this will go away. That I'm just going to, eventually I'll be like, it was just a dream. I'm not that concerned about it. But no, like we've seen before, or like we went over before, because of the nature of this dream and because God demands that this dream be interpreted correctly, Nebuchadnezzar is not going to drop it. It's not something that is going to be solved with time. It's something that's going to be solved by the sovereign power of God. So they go back and forth a couple times, and finally they admit, they're like, look, you're ridiculous. No one in the history of anyone has ever asked, what is this thing over here behind this curtain? And so, that it's a ridiculous request. They say, it is a very difficult thing to do, but obviously they're saying that it's impossible to do, and that it would require being a god, or at least having communication with gods, and that the gods do not reside in the flesh, which is kind of an interesting thing. If you, I don't think there is any connection or allusion to Jesus' incarnation, but it's kind of an interesting look at the power of God Himself in even becoming incarnate, in taking on flesh and doing that act. Not that wise men really know anything about the gods or God Himself, but that's an interesting perspective. But it's also an interesting admission from these wise men that they get so frustrated and they get so fearful that they say that it can't be done. That when faced with death, they reveal their true nature, that they don't have communication with the gods. They don't have these supernatural abilities. They have no insight into dreams, and they haven't had insight into dreams. They've always just been, they've been told a dream and they've given a false interpretation. They don't have any idea what to do or what they have done. So they had no insight into dreams in the past, and they won't have insight into dreams in the future. We know that, of course, God alone could reveal the dream and its interpretation because He alone is the ruler of that realm. And we're going to see that He's going to display His sovereignty over the world and that realm, which is part of the world, through His servant Daniel. And we'll see that Daniel recognizes that as well. So even though that Daniel and his friends received the same training as these guys, and probably, very probably, even learned from them. These guys were probably Daniel and his friends' teachers. Daniel knew that true knowledge and wisdom and understanding comes from God alone. But first, before we get to Daniel and his friends, Nebuchadnezzar decrees that all the wise men, including Daniel, are to be killed. And it's it kind of raises the stakes for this. It sets up a really, a confrontation between the king and his decree and Daniel with his revelation from God. And it's during the carrying out of this task that Daniel, instead of panicking, instead of fighting back, he simply asks the guy who's come to kill him, why is this happening? Why is this so urgent? What is on the king's mind? And it's from this exchange that we really can glean the fact that Daniel didn't know about this. He wasn't privy to the king's frustrations. He wasn't privy to the king's requests. And we can also safely assume that Daniel wasn't the first one that the captain of the king went to execute. It says that. So the decree went out, and the wise men. In the ESV, it says the wise men were about to be killed, but in the Holman and in NASB, I think it says they were being killed. And I think that is the better interpretation, because it's very unlikely that they went to kill Daniel first. That he would have been the first one to be killed amongst the wise men. No, there were probably lots of these magicians and sorcerers being killed as the guy gets around to Daniel. So let's look at Daniel's response to this trial, and it really is a trial that God puts him through. We had Nebuchadnezzar's problem, and now we have Daniel's solution, or the solution to the problem. And the first thing that Daniel did was he gathered information. So he was presented with a challenge, and he sought to find out relevant information. He said, what's going on? Why is this so urgent? What is this all about? And so Arioch tells him, he says, the king has had a dream, and he wants it interpreted, and no one can do it. And so Daniel now knows, okay, this is a situation that is going to require God. And so what he does next is he goes to the king and he asks for time. Now, why does the king grant Daniel's request instead of, all the other people's requests? Why would the king say, no to the Chaldeans all those times before, and Daniel comes to him now and he says, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And I think if we look at the differences between the requests, we can see why the king says okay. First, because again, we know that God sovereignly allowed Daniel this time to ask of him. We know that God is sovereignly working in the heart of Nebuchadnezzar to bring this dream to light, because that's really the whole point of this episode. God wants this dream and interpretation to be revealed for the Israelites there, for the Babylonians there, but also to be recorded in his word. But we can also see the difference between Daniel's request. Daniel simply asks Nebuchadnezzar to set a time for him to reveal the dream. So he says, hey, set a time, and it could be, any time after this, that I have to come back here and tell you what it is. And that's different from the Chaldeans who were either asking for what the dream was, or stalling for time by continuing to ask or admitting defeat. So Daniel doesn't do any of those things. All he says is, hey, set a time for me where I can come back and tell you the dream and the interpretation. And he says, that he's going to do it. He was upfront with his request for time. He was humble in the face of the king, knowing that if God wanted to reveal the dream to him, he would. So first Daniel gathered information. Second, he went to the king to ask for time. The third thing that Daniel did was take the matter to his friends. He sought their wisdom, he sought their counsel, and he sought their empathy. He wanted to be with them as they went to God to ask for mercy. So they trained together, yes, but more than that, they all believed in the same God. Daniel knew that he was among brothers, that he was among fellow believers and children of God, especially as the chosen race of God. And so he wanted to be with those people. And this care for these companions is a constant theme throughout the book. Daniel is the writer of the book, and he's obviously the main protagonist. But his friends are they're rarely far from him. They're always doing stuff together, and they're not always punished the same, and they don't always get the same revelation, but they usually suffer. They suffer the same trials, and they are always there to encourage one another and to be part of that group, the super friends. And so that was the third thing that Daniel does. And finally, and most importantly, they go to the Lord and ask him for mercy. Mercy because, by revealing the dream to them, they'll be out from under the king's death sentence. The wording there is that they might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now, even though this petition to God is the last step that Daniel took, I think it's clear that Daniel had God in the forefront of his mind the entire time, ever since Arioch came to kill him. That Daniel was always thinking of, okay, God is going to be the one that is going to see me through this thing. There's no way that Daniel would be so confident in his ability to reveal the dream unless he was trusting in God to do so. He wouldn't say, tell me when to come back and I'll tell you what the interpretation is, unless he was at that moment relying on God to give him that interpretation. But this formal time of asking God for help was a time of commitment to just that, and that's prayer. They had Daniel had done two things to make sure that he was able to go to God in prayer. He asked the king for time, and he went to his friends. And so those were two things that Daniel did to make sure that he had formal time to go before God and ask him for mercy. And so that's an application question that we can talk about now, or you can think about for afterwards. Do we make time to go to God in prayer? Do we make that commitment to go to God for help in times of need? Do we do what is necessary to create that time, like Daniel did? Do we take the steps that are needed, like, bringing it before friends or bringing it before other people? Do you ask those people to pray for you and to pray with you when we need God's help? So you can be thinking about that. The text goes on to say that God revealed the mystery to Daniel in a vision of the night. The phrase vision of the night usually brings up, what do we do during the night? We're sleeping. So, there's this vision of the night. And when we look at some other uses of the phrase, which would be in Hebrew, even though this phrase is in Aramaic, it's usually coupled with the word dream. So usually it's when he dreamt a vision of the night, or when he was having a dream and a vision of the night, etc., etc. But in this instance, when we read of Daniel's revelation, or God revealing the dream to Daniel, we don't see the word dream in there. Now, that doesn't say that we know for sure whether or not it was a dream, but we can infer that God gave Daniel the meaning of the dream while he was in prayer. So while they were asking God for the interpretation, God gave it to them, and that is really an amazing thing that God would, be so willing and so able, and of course he is, but that Daniel would receive that right away. Also, one commentator reasons that they probably wouldn't have gone to sleep, with that death sentence over their head. That they would probably be fervently in prayer until a solution presented itself, or until they were killed. So that's kind of an interesting way that we can look at how this dream was revealed. Either way, God reveals the dream to Daniel. Next week we'll see what that dream is, an interpretation. But before Daniel says, "Oh, I know what this is, I know what the dream is," he goes right away to respond to God. So they're in prayer, God reveals the dream to them, and Daniel can't help but praise God about this glorious wisdom and understanding that he's been granted. So this is Daniel's direct answer to God. Daniel is praying directly to God, a prayer of praise to the God who's delivered him from the king's wrath. And in this prayer, we can see a couple of things that Daniel reveals, really God reveals about himself, but that Daniel says that are themes throughout the book of Daniel. So Daniel acknowledges where wisdom and strength come from, that they come from God. We already read in chapter 1, verse 17, that the youths, Daniel and his friends, learned their learning and their skill in literature and their wisdom and Daniel's understanding and visions and dreams all came from God. God gave that to them as a gift. But here we can see Daniel's first-person deference to God's gift, not to his own skill and power. Daniel was very aware that any skill that he had was a gift from God. And specifically in this situation, that understanding was a direct revelation from God. Daniel also attributes to God the power over nature and nations. A God with a will isn't enough if he doesn't have the power to carry out that will. But God is powerful, and that is another thing that makes up God's sovereignty. We can see that from giving the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, to revealing the magician's ineptitude, to granting Daniel understanding. God is in control of every little aspect of this narrative. Even King Nebuchadnezzar, who has just conquered God's chosen people, is subject to his will. And that's kind of sometimes a hard pill to swallow. And I'm sure it was, well, I'm not sure, but it might have been a hard pill for Daniel and his friends to swallow. And some of the Israelites might not have swallowed that pill at all. That the God Yahweh is sovereign and all-powerful. You would think that being conquered and carried off into captivity is evidence that perhaps your God is weak and small. Why would God's chosen people be conquered and be made slaves to, people who worshipped other gods and who clearly didn't, worship the God of your fathers? What kind of God is that? But Daniel knows that all circumstances, even those that don't make sense to him, are subject to God's design. Daniel knew that God was in control of Nebuchadnezzar coming to Israel and taking the people captive. Daniel knew that God was in control with their diet. Daniel knows that God is in control now with this dream, and that God will be in control of whatever happens in the future. And so that's why we see this great theme of God's sovereignty throughout the book of Daniel, is because he's really kind of in that situation, and he understands that despite the circumstance of captivity, that God is in control. I think it's also particularly poignant to see how Daniel recognizes that it is Yahweh and not some random God that is sovereign over all. He refers specifically to God as, O God of my fathers. He understands that it is this God specifically, the God who brought the Israelites out of Egypt and has called them to, rule over Israel for that time. That is the one that is speaking to him and giving him this revelation. When you think about how old Daniel is right now, he's fairly young. He was considered a youth when he was taken and started training, so probably in the 13 to 18-year-old range. So now he's maybe max 20, 21 years old. And so he spent a large part of his adult life in Babylon, being trained in that culture. And yet still, even with all that influence on him, he still clings to Yahweh. He still clings to God and the God that he was taught and has revealed himself to him. So that kind of ends Daniel's prayer of praise to God, and he thanks him again for this specific revelation. So he kind of goes from general all the way to specific at the end of the prayer. And then next week we'll learn about what that revelation was. We'll learn about what the dream is and the interpretation, maybe, if that's the direction you want to go. Just some questions real quick. We know that God is sovereign. How do you make that